They say time buries the past, but sometimes all it takes is a scar and a look, a single moment, to unearth what decades of silence tried to keep hidden. Retired Army intelligence officer Malcolm Drew hadn't thought about Operation Echo Lantern in over 30 years. It was one of those covert missions erased from every file, denied by every superior, and hidden so deeply in his conscience that even dreams dared not disturb it. But one Thursday afternoon, in a quiet diner tucked away in the forgotten edges of Montana, everything changed when he saw the waitress's hand, her left one, badly scarred and oddly shaped. What startled him wasn't the injury itself, but the faded string of numbers tattooed beneath the skin graft. Coordinates. He knew them. They led directly to a place no one was ever supposed to talk about again. And somehow, this young woman, no older than 25, bore a piece of that mission on her skin. Malcolm's breath caught, and his hands trembled. He stared not just at a waitress, but at a ghost of a secret he thought had died overseas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Just a few hours before that moment, Malcolm had been driving the same rural road he always took to visit the tiny cabin he had built for himself after retirement. It was the kind of solitude people with too much history and too few answers needed, quiet, consistent, and far from the noise of a world he no longer understood. The town of Haverhill wasn't even on most maps anymore. It had a gas station with a single pump, a hardware store that doubled as a bait shop, and Margot's diner, where he always stopped for a hot meal before heading into the woods. The waitress that day wasn't one he remembered. Usually, Margot herself handled the orders, or her son Jake. But this time, someone new walked up to his booth, notepad in hand, eyes soft and distant. Her name tag read Callie. She seemed distracted, her smile hesitant, like someone fighting to stay present. Malcolm barely registered her voice as she recited the specials. But when she reached for his glass to refill his water, he saw it. The scar across her hand, thick and uneven, with skin that looked like it had endured fire or acid. And underneath it, partially hidden by the long sleeve of her shirt, a faded tattoo, 48 degrees 13 minutes 17 seconds north, 14 degrees 30 minutes 32 seconds east. The numbers hit him like a freight train. They weren't random. They were familiar in a way that bypassed memory and went straight to reflex. Malcolm had memorized them once. He had drawn them in dirt with the butt of a rifle. He had whispered them over encrypted channels and buried them in his mind after the operation was scrubbed and sealed. It couldn't be a coincidence. Coordinates that precise? The likelihood of someone, anyone, bearing those exact numbers by accident was astronomically low. And to see them here, in Haverhill, on a young woman's hand, was impossible. Unless someone survived. Unless something from Echo Lantern had followed him home. His world tilted slightly in that moment. The waitress, Callie, didn't seem to notice. She poured his water and walked away. But Malcolm couldn't take his eyes off her hand. Every old instinct, buried beneath years of retirement and denial, roared back to life. He felt his pulse race like it did when he was in uniform. His mind jumped into intelligence mode, scanning the diner for surveillance, checking exits, watching patrons. It was absurd, and yet it felt as real as the dirt of that long-forgotten place on the border of Slovakia, where Echo Lantern had taken place under midnight skies and whispered orders. He didn't eat his food. He didn't even sip the water. He just watched. Watched her serve a table of truckers, watched her slip into the kitchen, watched her pause every few steps like her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He tried to calm himself, to tell himself it was nothing, maybe an old war vet's fractured memory projecting meaning onto coincidence. But no matter how he tried to rationalize, one thing remained unshakable: those coordinates. He still remembered what they pointed to. a bunker, a fire, a girl. Back then, his job wasn't to rescue civilians, it was to extract intelligence. Echo Lantern had been about intercepting black market biotech transfers between rogue scientists operating in Cold War shadows. What they found was far more complex, a research facility hidden in the woods, experimenting on human subjects in the name of neurological weaponry. He remembered the files: kids, teens, some trafficked, some missing persons who were never found. He remembered seeing the aftermath. A lab in flames. One survivor. A young girl with burn marks and a serial tattoo on her hand. She had vanished in the confusion, presumed dead in the explosion that took out the lab. No one talked about her again. Until now. Malcolm sat frozen in his seat, the hum of the diner growing distant as the past surged forward with impossible clarity. His breath slowed, the air around him heavy with something old and dark. If this woman was that girl or even connected to her, it meant a truth he wasn't ready to face. That the past wasn't finished with him, that the mission wasn't truly over, and that maybe, just maybe, the most important part of his life wasn't what he had already done, but what he was about to uncover. Malcolm Drew's life after the military was one of deliberate simplicity, built like a fortress of routine to shield himself from the unpredictable chaos of memory. He had been a lieutenant colonel in Army intelligence, 27 years of deep cover work, black operations, and assignments that never saw daylight or documentation. He had no public commendations, no parades or medals, and certainly no official record of some of the things he'd witnessed or carried out in the name of national security. He had been a ghost for so long that when retirement finally came, it was both a relief and a burden. He bought 10 acres of land deep in the forests outside Haverhill, Montana, where the mountains met the clouds and phone signals disappeared. The cabin he built himself was modest. No electricity, no plumbing, no internet. Just a wood-burning stove, a small collection of books, and the sound of wind through the trees. He told himself he liked the solitude, but in truth he feared what company might bring. People asked questions. People reminded him he had once lived among them. Out here, no one expected him to talk about who he used to be or what he had done. Out here, he was just another aging man with a beard and a truck. Someone the townfolk politely nodded at but didn't press. He liked it that way. Most days were spent chopping wood, fixing the roof, or taking long hikes with his dog Boone, a husky lab mix who had no idea his owner once dismantled spy networks and mapped escape routes through enemy territory. Boone simply saw Malcolm as the man who fed him, scratched behind his ears, and spoke very little unless absolutely necessary. The cabin had no photos. The walls were bare. In the drawer beside his cot was a small box, a dented tin container with a broken hinge. Inside were 3 items: a tarnished silver lighter engraved with a date and a name he never spoke aloud, a folded piece of paper containing coordinates written in fading pencil, and a worn military patch with the insignia removed. He hadn't opened that box in years. To him, it was a symbol of everything he had left behind, a time capsule sealed by blood, fire, and silence. But now, sitting in Margot's diner, staring at that waitress with the scarred hand and haunted eyes, he realized the box might soon be reopened. Malcolm didn't believe in coincidences. The kind of work he did trained him to see patterns where others saw randomness, to connect dots across continents, years, and lies. So when he saw those numbers on her hand, he didn't dismiss them as a tattoo picked from a catalog or some hipster's ironic symbol. He saw a cipher, a breadcrumb, a message that fate had somehow wrapped around this young woman and placed directly in his path. But before he could confront the mystery, he had to confront himself, and that meant digging out the version of Malcolm he'd buried under a decade of lumberjack shirts and silent mornings. It wasn't easy. His body was stiffer now, movements slower. At 63, Malcolm had the strength of a man who still split logs by hand, but the stamina of someone who had spent years pushing his limits in ways no human was designed to endure. His back ached from old injuries, his knees groaned with every step, but his mind? That was still sharp, razor sharp. Information moved through it like electricity, instincts firing, even when he tried to suppress them. He remembered the way the girl had held the water pitcher, how her eyes didn't match the false smile on her lips. There was hesitation in her movements, like someone trained to hide pain but still caught in the rhythm of it. He left the diner that afternoon, without speaking a word to her. He paid his check, nodded to Margot, and walked out into the thin mountain air with a storm brewing inside him. He got into his truck, stared at the wheel for a full minute, then drove off, but not toward his cabin. He took a detour, circling back around town twice, parking down the street from the diner and watching from a distance. He hated that he was doing surveillance again. Hated the way his hands automatically reached for a pen and notebook, jotting down license plates, tracking the time each customer entered and exited. But old habits weren't just hard to break, they were embedded in his DNA. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night he didn't light a fire in the stove. He didn't cook. He sat on the front porch in the dark with Boone curled beside him, the tin box resting on his lap. He opened it slowly, as if afraid of what might crawl out. He took out the lighter first, flicked it once, and watched the tiny flame dance in the wind. Then he unfolded the paper and stared at the coordinates. 48 degrees 13 minutes 17 seconds north, 14 degrees 30 minutes 32 seconds east. The same ones. Not similar. Not close. Exact. And then the patch. He didn't need to see the insignia to know what it once bore. His old unit. The one that no longer existed on any official registry. The one that was disbanded after Echo Lantern went sideways. Memories came back in disjointed fragments. Fire in the trees. Screams in a language he couldn't translate. Children in cages. A lab built into the side of a cliff, masked by wilderness and sanctioned by shadows. And one girl, maybe 12 years old, sobbing through cracked lips, clutching a notebook with code scribbled in blood and ink. He had tried to help her. He remembered that. He had gotten her out. At least he thought he had. But when the explosion went off and the lab collapsed, everything was chaos. She was lost in the smoke. They told him she didn't make it. But if that waitress was her, if Callie was somehow connected, then someone had lied. Or worse, someone had covered it up. Malcolm didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark and listened to the forest breathe around him, his mind racing with possibilities. Tomorrow, he decided, he would return to the diner. Not for food, not for routine, but for answers. Because for the first time in years, something had cracked through the surface of his carefully constructed silence. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go. Not until he knew the truth. Not until he understood what those numbers were doing on her hand, and what they meant for both of them now. Haverhill was the kind of place where nothing happened fast, and most things never happened at all. Tucked between two weather-beaten ridges in the upper corner of Montana, it wasn't even a town so much as a patchwork of human persistence. With a population of barely 300, it was where people went to disappear. Farmers who never left, loners who never fit in, and those with stories they never wanted to tell again. The local gas station doubled as the post office. The hardware store was also where you could get your deer tags, and everyone knew not just each other's names, but their parents, siblings, and the brand of dog food they used. Life here moved in quiet loops, sunrises over frost-bitten fields, Sunday sermons at the chapel with peeling paint, and coffee poured into the same chipped mugs at Margot's diner 7 days a week. The air always smelled faintly of pine and smoke, as if the forest itself was in a permanent state of exhale. Winters came early and stayed late, burying the roads in thick snow and cutting the town off from outsiders for weeks. Cell service was patchy at best, and most people still used landlines. A single sheriff's deputy patrolled the stretch of highway that curved through the valley. And the most serious crime in the last decade had been a bar fight that ended with 2 broken noses and a town-wide chili cook-off to make peace. In other words, Haverhill was a place perfectly designed to keep secrets buried and equally suited for secrets to return when least expected. Malcolm had chosen the area not because of what it offered, but because of what it lacked: surveillance, suspicion, noise. He wanted a place that didn't ask questions, and Haverhill, in its frozen stillness, had delivered. The people here had seen just enough hardship to recognize it in someone else's eyes and respect the silence that came with it. No one pried into his past, and he didn't offer it. His cabin sat 7 miles outside of the town limits, hidden behind a thicket of spruce and rock. The dirt road leading up to it was unmarked, and in winter, impassable unless you had chains and a strong will. The nearest neighbor was a widowed rancher named Earl, who once gave Malcolm a stack of firewood without a word and never came back for the favor. That was the kind of town Haverhill was: simple gestures, unspoken understandings. Margot's Diner was the town's social heart. A squat building with faded yellow siding and a crooked neon sign that buzzed louder than it glowed. It had been there for nearly 40 years. The floor creaked under every step, and the booth seats were patched with duct tape, but the coffee was always hot, and the food, if not memorable, was reliably warm. The walls were lined with photos of hunting trips, high school football teams, and a few war veterans in black and white, their faces stern and distant. Malcolm had never asked to have his photo added to the wall. He didn't want the questions that would follow. To most people there, he was just the guy who came in twice a week, sat in the back corner, and tipped in cash. Quiet, polite, and utterly forgettable. Until now. The morning after he saw the waitress's hand, Malcolm returned to the diner just after it opened. The air was crisp, still holding the chill from the night before, and frost clung to the edges of the windows like a ghost trying to get in. He parked in the same spot he always did, boots crunching against gravel as he stepped onto the porch. The bell above the door gave its usual tinny jingle as he entered, and the familiar warmth and smell of frying bacon greeted him like an old friend, trying to remind him everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. The usual crowd was there: Earl sipping black coffee in his hunting jacket, the Jensen twins arguing over whose turn it was to fix the barn roof, and Margot behind the counter with her hair in a loose bun, wiping down menus. But Callie wasn't. Not yet. Malcolm took his seat in the far booth and waited. Every creak of the door made his muscles tense slightly, and he found himself scanning every movement, every glance. Years of conditioning had trained him to observe without appearing to listen between words and watch for shadows where no one else looked. And now that part of him, the part he had buried, was wide awake. When Callie finally walked in from the back, a tray tucked under one arm and her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, Malcolm noticed everything. The way her shoulders slumped slightly when she thought no one was watching. The way her eyes flicked to the corner of the room every few minutes, like she was expecting someone or something to appear. Her uniform was standard, a navy apron and white button-down, but the sleeves were long today, pulled down past her wrists. He didn't see the scar again. Not yet. But he knew it was there. The diner around him buzzed with quiet conversation, the clink of forks on plates, the low hum of the radio playing classic country songs that hadn't been popular in 40 years. It was all so ordinary, so deliberately mundane, and yet Malcolm felt the weight of the past pressing through the cracks. He thought of that lab, the fire, the codes they found etched into metal trays and scratched into the walls. He thought of the girl, her eyes wide with confusion, her body covered in burns. Could that have been Callie? Could a child from a black site in Eastern Europe have somehow ended up as a waitress in the middle of Montana? More importantly, was she here by chance or by design? Malcolm knew better than to believe in accidents. The world he came from didn't allow for them. Everything was cause and effect, patterns, loops, agents planted in places they could disappear into, witnesses relocated under new names, given new lives, new birthdays, and just enough truth to keep their lies believable. If Callie had been rescued and placed here, someone had decided it was safe. Someone had orchestrated her silence. But if she wasn't part of a protection program, if she had come here on her own, then maybe she was looking for something, or someone, and that meant time was running out. Malcolm had spent most of his adult life shadowing powerful men who never wanted their names spoken aloud. These weren't the kind of villains found in storybooks or movie scripts. They were cold, efficient architects of secrecy, their cruelty wrapped in protocol, their ruthlessness justified by lines on maps and numbers in budgets. And yet, of all the people he'd encountered in his decades of service, no one unsettled him like Victor Strand. Strand had been more than a superior officer. He had been the silent brain behind missions that were too dangerous to brief in full and too illegal to ever acknowledge. While others operated within rules, Strand built his legacy on bending and breaking them, all while wearing the face of patriotism. He was the kind of man who could smile while condemning 10 people to death, then walk into a gala and shake hands with senators. Malcolm had only worked under him directly once, Operation Echo Lantern. It had been enough to leave an imprint on his conscience that never washed off. The mission had been classified as a high-value intelligence recovery from a defunct Soviet-era biolab in the Carpathian region. Officially, they were meant to retrieve research assets before they fell into hostile hands. Unofficially, they were sent to dismantle the facility and eliminate anything that breathed inside it. Strand made it clear: no survivors, no questions. But Malcolm and 2 others, Langston and Herrera, had broken protocol. They hadn't been able to ignore the human element. What they saw there haunted them. Children, dozens of them, some barely old enough to walk, strapped to machines, wired to electrodes, sedated and restrained. What had started as science had turned into something far darker. They were not test subjects, they were prisoners. Malcolm remembered the confrontation vividly. Strand had arrived mid-op in a black helicopter, wearing a civilian coat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. When Malcolm and Langston argued that at least some of the children should be evacuated, Strand dismissed it with a single line: "Collateral doesn't get extracted." That was the moment the last thread of Malcolm's obedience snapped. But rebellion came at a cost. The facility was rigged to explode. The timeline was shortened. And when the smoke cleared, Strand disappeared from the report, his name scrubbed from every piece of documentation. The survivors, if any, were scattered to the wind. The mission was marked a success. Closed. Forgotten. But now, in a dusty booth in Margot's diner, watching Callie refill coffee like any normal young woman, Malcolm felt a chill creep up his spine. If this girl bore the coordinates to that facility, then she hadn't been lost. She had been marked, tagged, identified for something, which could only mean one thing. Strand's reach hadn't ended in Europe. It had followed her. Or worse, it had placed her here. The deeper question burrowed into Malcolm's mind like a splinter. If Callie was connected to Echo Lantern, then where was Strand now? Retired? Disgraced? Dead? Men like him didn't vanish quietly. They repositioned. They reinvented. They built new empires in the dark. Strand was a hydra. Cut off one head, 2 more appeared in its place. He had influence in private defense firms, biotech companies, shell organizations with names like Halberd Systems and Vexton Solutions. If he still operated within those shadows, then Callie's presence here wasn't just dangerous. It was a provocation. A signal. Something was being set in motion again. Malcolm's thoughts grew heavier. He had walked away from that world thinking his silence was the price of survival. But now he saw it clearly. His silence might have bought someone else's suffering. If Strand was still moving pieces on the board, then Malcolm's retreat into the mountains wasn't noble. It was cowardice dressed as peace. Back in the diner, Callie moved between tables, her movements rehearsed but not robotic. She smiled when expected, laughed at a joke from a regular, and scribbled notes with a left hand that remained mostly hidden by her sleeve. But every so often, she'd glance toward the front door, not with fear, but with expectation, as if waiting for someone who hadn't shown up yet. Malcolm caught the pattern. Every 7 minutes, her eyes flicked up. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was learned behavior, a habit formed from watching, surveillance training, observation. He felt his chest tighten. Was she watching for Strand, or one of his proxies? Could she be here on her own mission? And if so, had she come looking for him? The idea unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He had lived with guilt for decades, but it had always been a private burden. Now it had a face. And the face wore a waitress's uniform in a quiet Montana diner. He finished his coffee and stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his joints and the heat of adrenaline pumping beneath the surface. On his way to the register, he passed her. She turned slightly, gave a polite nod, and for just a heartbeat, their eyes locked. It was long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Recognition, not of each other, but of shared weight. Shared scars. It was the kind of look you only saw between people who had survived something that should have killed them. As he stepped outside into the cold, he didn't notice the black SUV parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted. He didn't see the man inside it watching the diner through binoculars, jotting notes onto a tablet with fingers too precise for a casual observer. He didn't see the photograph on the dashboard, his own face, grainy and dated, labeled with a name that hadn't been used in over 20 years. Victor Strand hadn't forgotten Malcolm Drew. He had simply waited. And now, the game was back on. For the next week, Malcolm returned to Margot's diner every day, precisely at 7:45 a.m., always sitting in the same back booth near the window, the one with the best vantage of both the parking lot and the kitchen door. It was the kind of behavior that would seem like habit to most, just a regular, older man finding comfort in routine, but to Malcolm it was reconnaissance. This was no longer about curiosity. It was pattern identification, the kind of slow, quiet intelligence gathering he had once mastered overseas. He wasn't just watching Callie now. He was studying her, watching the way she moved, where her attention lingered, who she spoke to when she left for breaks, what she did with her hands when she thought no one was looking. Everything she did fed a silent stream of analysis in Malcolm's mind, one piece stacking on top of another. The pattern was always the same. She arrived at 7:30, 15 minutes before he did. She never drove. She walked from somewhere east of the diner, the same side as the old textile warehouse that had been abandoned for years. She wore long sleeves regardless of temperature and always kept her left hand partially hidden, either by holding a towel, carrying a tray, or folding it under her right arm when idle. She never used her phone while working, but once each day, always at 9:22 a.m., she slipped into the back room for a 3-minute break. When she returned, her expression was slightly altered, more guarded, like she'd stepped into another reality and then pulled herself back just enough to serve coffee again. Malcolm had seen similar behaviors in operatives who were embedded deep under non-official cover, people pretending to be civilians while relaying messages through burner phones or encrypted apps. The time consistency, the emotional shift. It wasn't just a break. It was a ritual, a check-in, a report. That wasn't all. 2 days into his observation, Malcolm noticed the same gray sedan parked across the street. The car never moved. It had no decals, no obvious markings, but it was always there by the time he arrived and gone by the time he left. The windows were tinted. No one ever got in or out while Malcolm was inside. At first, he wondered if it belonged to a local, but he knew every car in town. That one didn't belong to anyone who lived here. It was surveillance, and if they were watching him, then they were watching her too. That's when the weight of the past came pressing hard. He remembered Langston's funeral, closed casket, a heart attack on paper but a silenced weapon in reality. He remembered the final conversation he had with Herrera, who had vanished 2 weeks later without a trace. Everyone who had tried to speak about Echo Lantern had been silenced or scattered. And now, the last living remnant of that operation, The girl who was never supposed to survive had surfaced, and she was within arm's reach. But Malcolm couldn't make his move yet, not until he knew what side she was on, or who she was signaling. He began altering his own behavior subtly to test her awareness. One morning, he paid with a credit card instead of cash. Another day, he asked for a different booth. He arrived once 15 minutes early, and another time an hour late. Each change was a probe, each deviation a signal to see if she reacted. And she did. Not obviously, but enough. Her eyes flicked to him more often. She hesitated slightly before approaching his table. Once, she accidentally poured coffee into his glass of water, apologized, and then quickly excused herself to the kitchen. Malcolm didn't believe it was a mistake. It was distraction behavior, a tactic used to mask sudden anxiety or compromised focus. She knew something. She remembered something. And the scar on her hand wasn't just a remnant of the past. It was a brand, a warning, a symbol of what they had done to her. On the 5th day, the rhythm changed. Malcolm had just finished his eggs when he saw her hand again. Clearly this time. She reached across to grab his plate, and her sleeve slid up. The scar was brutal, a patchwork of old burns and skin grafts, but it was what lay beneath it that mattered. Tattooed in faded ink, just below the wrist, were 3 sets of digits: 4,813, 1732, 14N. The rest was distorted, barely visible, but the message was clear. Coordinates, identical to the ones from the lab. Only these were marked into her skin, not as a souvenir, but as an identity tag, like she had been cataloged, owned, labeled by someone who treated human life like a spreadsheet. Malcolm's breath caught, she noticed. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither looked away. For a moment, the diner dissolved. The clatter of dishes, the country music, the chatter, it all faded into a silence as heavy as concrete. He didn't speak, neither did she, but the unspoken tension stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. There was knowledge there, shared recognition, and beneath it a question: are you part of this, or are you here to end it? That night, Malcolm didn't go back to the cabin. He drove instead to the edge of town and parked near the tree line, deep in the woods, where no one could follow without leaving a trail. There, in the back of his truck, he unzipped an old military duffel he hadn't touched in 10 years. Inside were the tools of a man he thought he no longer was: a suppressed sidearm, encrypted satellite phone, lock-picking kit, and a set of burner IDs with 3 different names. He checked them all. Still valid, still viable. He pulled out a photo, too, one he had hidden beneath the false bottom of the bag. It was grainy, taken during the chaos of Echo Lantern, but the girl in it was unmistakable. The eyes, the posture. She was younger then, maybe 12 or 13, but the shape of her jaw, the slant of her brow, it matched Callie's perfectly. There was no longer any doubt. She was the girl from the lab, and she had been placed here, or had come here, with purpose. But what that purpose was, Malcolm still didn't know. And if Victor Strand was truly behind it, the ritual was only beginning. Because men like Strand didn't work in events, they worked in cycles, in patterns, and every pattern eventually repeated. Back at the motel, Marshall stared at the ceiling as the air conditioner hummed its low, tired lullaby. Sleep had become a stranger again. Since leaving the Rusty Bean, the waitress's scarred hand haunted his thoughts like a recurring battlefield dream. He'd only caught a glimpse, but it had burned into his memory. The jagged lines, oddly familiar, like a crude topography map seared into skin. He kept trying to convince himself it was a coincidence, that he was reading too much into it. But there was something else, a detail that refused to let go. Her name, Emery. The moment he'd heard it, something stirred in the back of his mind. Not the name itself, but its cadence, its softness. Like a word whispered through the crackling radio decades ago, drowned out by static and urgency. He rose from bed and retrieved his duffel bag from the corner. Among the socks, t-shirts, and a few aging photographs was a weathered leather notebook. He hadn't opened it in years. Its pages held memories from his service, coordinates, sketches, encrypted phrases only he could decipher. It was his personal war journal, carefully constructed so that even if it were confiscated, no outsider could trace its meanings. But he had written something down about that day, that mission, the one that went so horribly wrong. He flipped through the pages with unsteady hands until he found it. A series of entries dated November 1989. Coldstream operation. Civilians displaced. 4 casualties. Secondary structure collapsed. Girl with hand injury. Evac failed. Marshall read those lines over and over, each time hoping they would rewrite themselves into something different. That entry had always tormented him. He'd gone back for the girl, but the structure had given out. Fire and chaos consumed the building, and command had ordered a full retreat. They never found her. Never found a body, either. She had been collateral in a mission that was supposed to be clean. But what if they were wrong? What if she'd survived? What if she had grown up, scarred and alone, believing the man who promised to help her had abandoned her? The more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to align. The girl had been around 10. Emery looked to be in her early 40s. The timeline added up. The hand. The name. The piercing, unreadable look in her eyes. Marshall clutched the notebook and closed his eyes. He hadn't told anyone about her, not even his unit, after the fact. It had felt like his personal burden, a quiet debt he carried with him through the years. He had never expected to pay it. And yet here he was, standing in a town he'd never planned to visit, reeling from a chance encounter with a waitress, who might very well be a ghost from his battlefield. The next morning, Marshall returned to the diner, this time dressed in the same black windbreaker he'd worn during deployments. Emery wasn't there. A younger waitress greeted him and brought him coffee. He asked about Emery casually, trying not to betray his anxiety. "She usually works late mornings," the girl said. "She had to leave early yesterday. Not feeling well, I think." Marshall nodded and tried to mask his disappointment. He drank his coffee in silence, unsure if he was grateful or uneasy about her absence. Was she avoiding him? Did she recognize him? Or had he misread everything? That evening, unable to rest, he drove to the edge of town and found a small internet cafe near a grocery store. He wasn't much for technology, but he managed to pull up an old military forum. He searched for declassified documents relating to Operation Coldstream. Most of the details were redacted. A few threads mentioned civilian injuries but lacked names or outcomes. Then he found a photo, blurry and scanned from an old print. It showed his squad, 4 men in fatigues standing outside the ruined building. In the background, if you squinted, there was a child's silhouette in the smoke. It sent a chill down his spine. He remembered now. The girl had been clutching something in her hands, a stuffed bear or maybe a worn cloth. She had screamed when the roof started to collapse. He'd shouted for backup, but the radio had gone dead. She had screamed, and then the flames had swallowed the sound. Marshall felt the same hollow sensation in his chest now as he had then. Driving back to the motel, he passed the diner and saw it was still open. Lights glowed dimly through the blinds, and a few patrons lingered over pie and coffee. He debated whether to go in. Part of him screamed to turn around, to leave this town and forget he ever saw her. But another part, the one forged in service and duty, knew he couldn't. He had to know the truth, not just for her, but for himself. He parked the truck and walked in. Emery was behind the counter, refilling salt shakers. She looked up, her expression unreadable. He sat at the far end, away from the other customers, and waited. When she walked over, he noticed her hand again. The scarring was unmistakable. Raised and uneven, it twisted around her knuckles and stretched up her wrist, a pattern that didn't make sense until it did. It wasn't just a burn. It was a burn over coordinates. The kind of thing a child might not understand, but a veteran would recognize in a heartbeat. They had burned into her during the blast, hot metal from a tactical map or equipment panel. He looked up at her, and for the first time their eyes locked in mutual recognition. No words were spoken, no dramatic gestures. Just a silence that screamed louder than memory. And then, with the gentlest nod, she turned and walked away. Marshall sat there, stunned, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in decades. It wasn't over, not even close. The past had returned, not as a punishment, but maybe, just maybe, as a second chance. Will sat on the edge of his motel bed that night, the weight of the day pressing down on his chest like an iron vest. The room was dim, lit only by the flicker of a muted television that played old sitcoms he wasn't watching. His thoughts ran in circles, looping around that waitress's scarred hand, the trembling in her voice, the look in her eyes when he said the words, Kundar Province. The name alone shouldn't have meant anything to a waitress in a quiet town in the Pacific Northwest, yet she flinched like he'd struck a nerve. He remembered the feeling in his gut when he'd seen those coordinates, etched into her skin like a map drawn in fire. It wasn't just coincidence. It couldn't be. That province was where his darkest mission had unfolded, one buried so deeply in red tape and classified files that not even most of his fellow soldiers knew the whole story. And yet, here she was, Raya, the name still sharp in his mind, with coordinates that aligned perfectly with the drop site from the infamous Operation Iron Fleece. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, face buried in his calloused hands. The past had clawed its way back with ferocity. He hadn't spoken about Iron Fleece in over 20 years. Back then, he'd been part of a special operations task force tasked with extracting a rogue engineer, one who had been building weapons for the insurgents under the radar of both Allied forces and his own government. The mission had gone south faster than anyone anticipated. The insurgents were tipped off. A firefight broke out near the village center, and civilians had been caught in the crossfire. Will had always remembered the fire, the chaos, and the harrowing choice he had to make when he pulled a small girl from the wreckage of her home while her family burned behind her. She had been unconscious, her tiny hand scorched and mangled from the blast. He carried her to the evac chopper while the rest of his unit covered the retreat. He never learned what happened to her after that. He wasn't supposed to know. In the military, you didn't follow civilian leads post-mission. You moved on. You didn't look back. But now he couldn't look away. The next morning, the clouds hung low like they were listening. Will stood outside the diner, his boots planted firm in the gravel parking lot, heart thudding as if about to leap from his chest. When he stepped inside, Raya was already behind the counter, hair pulled back in a loose braid, her expression unreadable. For a long second, their eyes met. She gave a faint nod, a silent acknowledgement that everything between them had shifted. He sat at the counter again, same stool, same position as the day before. There were other customers trickling in, regulars by the look of it, but she made her way over to him with deliberate steps. Before she could even ask for his order, he spoke. He told her about Iron Fleece, about the drop site, about the burning village. He described carrying a small, unconscious girl with a wounded hand out of the rubble. He didn't know why he told her. Maybe he was hoping she'd deny it, say he was mistaken, that the coordinates meant something else, that her past wasn't scorched into the same history as his. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered a name. Mariam. It was the name of her sister, the one who didn't make it. Raya had been the girl he carried, the one the doctors said might not survive the night. Somehow, she had. She told him she'd been adopted by a relief worker stationed at a nearby base. They'd taken her to Germany for treatment, and then later to the States. She grew up surrounded by kindness, but the nightmares always followed her. She got the coordinates tattooed when she turned 18, not out of sentimentality, but so she would never forget where her life changed and where it nearly ended. Will swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing unbearable. He had never known her name, her story, her survival. To see her now, Fully grown, working quietly in a town far from any battlefield, was like meeting a ghost he had saved. They spoke for nearly an hour that morning, her shift be damned. The other waitstaff took over her tables, while the two of them sat at a side booth. They filled in the blanks for each other, their memories stitched together like pages of a forgotten journal. She told him about her adopted mother, a nurse named Evelyn, and the nights spent in therapy trying to reconstruct the face of the man who carried her from the fire. All she remembered were strong arms, soot-covered skin, and the smell of gasoline and sweat. He told her how he remembered the blood dripping down her fingers, how he was ordered to leave her with the medics and move on with the next mission. Neither of them expected to ever cross paths again. The irony, the tragedy, the miracle of it all hung thick between them like fog. And yet, somehow, neither of them questioned it. The universe, it seemed, had orchestrated something beyond either of their understanding. But just as the moment began to settle, as Will considered what it might mean to reconnect with someone tied to such a painful past, a stranger entered the diner. He was tall, built like a wall, with eyes that scanned the room too carefully. He wore a civilian jacket, but Will immediately spotted the rigid stance of a man trained in military posture. Their eyes locked briefly. The stranger nodded politely at Raya, then chose a booth 2 tables down. Will's instincts prickled. That kind of man didn't just wander into diners like this unless he was looking for something, or someone. Will knew it in his bones. The past wasn't done with either of them yet. Miles didn't sleep that night. After leaving the diner and returning to his cabin, he sat in silence, staring at the fading embers of a fire he had let burn low in the stone hearth. The soft crackle of the last sparks did nothing to settle the storm inside him. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, memories, possibilities, and fears, each pulling at him with equal force. He had tried to rationalize what he'd seen, to convince himself it was just coincidence. A girl with a scar, a strange resemblance, a vague connection to coordinates from long ago. But the truth tugged at something deeper, his gut, the place where instinct lived, and it refused to quiet down. He had seen too much, lived too much, not to know when something truly unusual had crossed his path. The next morning, Miles returned to the diner. It was earlier than usual, and the place was barely open. A sleepy-eyed cook flipped through a newspaper behind the counter, and the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of a spatula on the griddle. Then, she walked out from the kitchen. Her brown apron was tied tightly at the back, hair pulled up messily again, and that same scarred hand carried a tray of condiments to a table. She looked up, and for a second, her expression flickered with something almost like expectation, like she'd known he would be back. He didn't wait for her to greet him this time. He walked straight to the booth, sat down, and folded his hands tightly on the table. She approached with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Morning again," she said gently, setting a menu down even though they both knew he wouldn't open it. "Didn't expect to see you this soon." He looked at her hand. She noticed. She tucked it subtly behind the other and lowered her gaze. Miles leaned in slightly, keeping his voice steady. "That scar. I've seen it before. Or something exactly like it." Her body stiffened. "I don't know what you mean," she said too quickly, and turned as if to leave. "Please," he said, louder. She froze. "Where did you get it?" There was a beat of stillness. Then she sat across from him. Her voice was flat, cold. "Why does it matter to you?" Miles hesitated. This wasn't about pushing. This wasn't about confrontation. He needed her to understand he wasn't a threat. "Because 15 years ago, I was on a mission that went sideways. We were supposed to evacuate a village near coordinates that matched something I saw on your hand. We got ambushed. There were survivors, barely. One of them was a child. She had a scar, burned in the same pattern." The girl stared at him. Her expression collapsed into something unreadable. "You're talking about Adaba Valley," she whispered. The name hit him like a brick. No one was supposed to know that location. It had been scrubbed from all official records. It didn't even show up on maps anymore. "How do you know that?" he asked, stunned. She slowly extended her hand again, letting the light hit the scar fully this time. "Because I was that child." A silence fell between them like a curtain. Miles couldn't move. His breath caught in his chest as his mind filled with overlapping images of the fire, the screams, the chaos, the burning village, the terrified girl clutching a ragged doll, crying in a language he didn't understand but whose fear transcended words. "You were her," he said, almost in disbelief. She nodded. "I was 7. My mother told me to hide when the gunfire started. I ran to the fields. I fell, got burned. Someone carried me out, dragged me across the rice terraces until we reached a safe spot. He was American. He had a patch on his chest that said, 'Miles.' I never forgot it." His vision blurred. He remembered the girl vividly now. She had clung to him, trembling, as he tried to stop the bleeding from her arm. They didn't know if she would make it. When evac helicopters arrived hours later, she was unconscious. He never knew what happened to her afterward. "I tried to find you," he said quietly, years later. "I sent requests through the embassy, but no one could tell me anything. I thought maybe you—" "Died?" she offered. He didn't answer. "We were moved around a lot," she said. "Refugee camps, then a sponsorship by a church group. I ended up in the foster system eventually. No one ever really told me what happened back there. Just that a soldier saved me. I remembered the name. When I saw you walk in yesterday, I wasn't sure. But now I know." Miles felt a strange ache in his chest, the kind of pain that came from both healing and hurting at the same time. All those years of guilt, of wondering if what he did mattered, if the choices he made meant anything, they all condensed into this moment. "What's your name now?" he asked. "Mina," she replied. "But back then I was called Minara." He smiled faintly. "Minara, I remember that now." They sat in silence for a long time, and for once, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a page had turned, like the past had finally found its voice. Eventually she stood. "I should get back to work, but thank you for coming back, for being real." Miles nodded. As she walked away, he realized something profound. He hadn't come to this town for peace or scenery. He had been drawn here for closure. And now, maybe for a second chance. Not just for her, but for himself. Dawson walked out of the park with a heaviness in his chest that was new, unfamiliar, and uncomfortable in its intensity. The evening breeze brushing against his skin did little to ease the pressure building within him. It was like trying to hold back a flood with a thin wall of silence. His mind wasn't racing. It was marching, steady and deliberate, through each word Ava had spoken. Every sentence peeled back another layer of time and memory, exposing the rawness of a past he thought had been buried in the desert dust. He wasn't angry, not at her, but his thoughts twisted in on themselves in knots. What were the odds that this scarred young woman, working tables in a diner in El Paso, would carry coordinates that matched the most classified, gut-wrenching mission of his life? That she would be the living link between his ghosts and the present moment? He returned to his truck but didn't start it. Just sat there with his keys in his hand, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. For a long while, he didn't move. He thought of his squad, their voices, their sarcasm, the way they'd slapped each other on the back after every successful op. And then he thought of that mission, the one the Pentagon had sealed and buried in its deepest vaults. The night of the convoy ambush, the burning wreckage, the coordinates marked on that crumpled intel sheet. Ava's mother had been caught in that chaos, in a village they were never supposed to be near. Her injury, her disappearance, the whispers of civilian casualties no one would admit to. It all came back in waves, harder and heavier with every breath. Eventually, he started the engine and drove, not home, not toward any known destination. His truck took him east, toward the desert highway that led out of town. The city lights fell behind him as the road stretched into shadow and silence. He needed space. Distance. Not to run, but to think. To clear the battlefield of his mind. Somewhere past the mile markers and flickering gas stations, he found a lookout point, a flat patch overlooking the canyon ridges, bathed in the silver light of a near full moon. He parked, stepped out, and leaned against the hood of the truck, arms crossed, head low. For nearly an hour he let the desert wind carry his memories across the sand. And when he finally turned his thoughts back to Ava, it wasn't with suspicion, but with sorrow. She hadn't known what she was showing him when she extended her scarred hand. She hadn't orchestrated some elaborate scheme to stir his trauma. She was the unintentional bridge between what had happened and what had been lost. The girl was just trying to connect dots in her own broken past, hoping that maybe someone, anyone, could help her find peace. And now, by some cruel twist of fate, it was up to him. The next morning he returned to the diner. His clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the truck, his hair disheveled, but his eyes held a clarity they hadn't in years. Ava was already working, moving between booths with quiet efficiency, until she noticed him standing just inside the door. Her face froze, and for a moment the tension was thick enough to stop time. But he raised a hand, not in warning, not in command, just a simple gesture of peace. She nodded and approached slowly, eyes searching his face for any signs of anger or resentment. Instead, she found only gravity. They sat in the corner booth again, this time without coffee, without pleasantries, just presence. Dawson pulled a weathered notebook from his jacket, a small, green military-issue field log, its edges curled and stained with time. He placed it on the table and slid it across to her. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before she opened it. Inside were notes, sketches, dates, scribbled memories from his deployments, and among them a circled entry. 3 clicks south of Cordova checkpoint. 11 civilian casualties, 1 child survivor. Coordinates burned in. She read it silently, lips moving slightly with the words, before lifting her gaze to meet his. "That child," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Your mother was one of the injured. I don't know what happened after evac. We were pulled out. Orders came fast. They kept everything quiet." Ava sat back, exhaling deeply, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. She traced the page with trembling fingers. "I always thought she was just caught in an accident. No one ever explained anything, not clearly, just said she was hurt while traveling." "She was more than caught," Dawson said. "She was part of a storm we didn't even understand. That mission, I've carried it like a shrapnel shard in my mind. But you were the child." The revelation hung in the air, solemn and still. Ava closed the notebook, clutching it to her chest. "I always wanted to know why she looked so afraid sometimes. Why she wouldn't talk about the past. I never thought someone from her nightmare would be sitting here, helping me understand it." Dawson's jaw tightened, not with rage, but resolve. "I don't know if this gives you peace, Ava, but I want to help you find the rest of the story, if you're willing." She nodded, lips quivering but forming a firm yes. That day marked a turning point. No longer strangers bound by coincidence, they began a reluctant alliance. 2 wounded souls determined to fill in the blanks that trauma had left behind. Dawson didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in decades, he felt that maybe, just maybe, uncovering the truth could heal more than just Ava's questions. It might finally lay to rest the ghosts he had lived with for far too long. The air inside the diner felt heavier than usual that day, even though the rain had stopped and the sky outside glowed with soft hues of late-afternoon amber. Jonathan sat back at his usual booth by the window, hands wrapped around a half-full mug of black coffee gone lukewarm. He hadn't been able to eat much since the confrontation behind the building days ago, when he'd seen those numbers carved into the waitress's hand, numbers that matched the coordinates of the most classified mission he'd ever executed during the war. The sight of them still burned in his mind, not just for what they were, but for what they implied. It was no coincidence. It couldn't be. There were too many layers to it, too many buried truths clawing their way back to the surface of his memory, each one screaming to be acknowledged. He stared across the room at Elise, who had resumed working her shifts like nothing had happened. Her wrist was bandaged now, white cloth wrapped snugly around the area where he'd seen the scar. He wondered if it still burned for her the way it did for him, both physically and emotionally. She smiled and took orders, and refilled cups as though she weren't carrying a secret that had the power to implode both of their lives. Jonathan hadn't approached her again since that moment behind the diner. He needed time. He needed clarity. But mostly, he needed to confirm what his instincts had started screaming at him. Elise was connected to the mission in Darzun. Whether by blood, fate, or something else, she was the thread that tied his past to this present, and until he unraveled it, he wouldn't sleep another peaceful night. He had spent the past few evenings digging. Old maps, declassified briefings, military dossiers he wasn't technically supposed to still have copies of. It had all come back with a vengeance. Operation Severance, the coded messages intercepted by foreign agents, the unmarked facility in the hills where the final standoff took place. And one detail stood out above all. There was a civilian believed to be in the blast radius during their final sweep. A child. At the time, intelligence had deemed it unconfirmed, a possibility, nothing more. No one in command followed up. The mission was buried under layers of denial and justification, and any dissenting questions were silenced by promotion or discharge. But Jonathan remembered the screams. He remembered the voice over the comms that night, reporting movement from the northeast corridor. Soft, erratic, like someone running barefoot across gravel. He remembered holding his breath when he pulled the trigger, aiming into shadows lit only by tracer fire and adrenaline. And now, he remembered the silence that followed. Deafening, bottomless silence, the kind that never quite lets go. That afternoon, instead of his usual routine, Jonathan waited until Elise's shift ended. He watched from his booth as she pulled her apron off, wiped down the counter one last time, and gave the cook a casual wave. She stepped outside and made her way to the edge of the parking lot, where her beat-up sedan was parked under a flickering street lamp. Jonathan followed her out, heart pounding with the rhythm of a man walking through a memory he never wanted to relive. "Elise," he called out before she could open her car door. She turned slowly, unsure at first whether to smile or brace herself. He held up both hands to signal peace. "I'm not here to push. I'm just here to ask." She hesitated, then nodded once. They stood there, a few feet apart, the dying light catching the soft red glint of her hair and the faint tremble in her hands. "Those numbers on your wrist," he said. "I need to know what they mean to you." Her eyes flickered with the ghost of something, a memory perhaps, or a warning, and she exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she'd held for far too long. "They're the last thing I remember before everything went dark," she said. "I was 5. My mother carried me out of a building. I don't know how she made it, but I remember her screaming, clutching me, and fire all around. She burned. I burned. But I survived, and I never knew what it meant until you looked at me like that." Jonathan felt the weight of her words hit him like a gut punch. 5 years old. That would line up exactly. He had pulled that trigger thinking it was enemy movement. The coordinates had led them to believe it was a weapons facility. But maybe it was more. Maybe they had destroyed something else entirely. "Your mother?" he asked gently. Was she from Darzun?" Elise nodded. "She told me it was her home before everything changed. She wouldn't talk about it. Said it was too dangerous, too painful. She died when I was 9. I only found the coordinates later, etched into a keepsake she always wore. I had them burned into my skin as a reminder. A mystery I thought I'd never solve." Jonathan's throat tightened. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was revelation. Redemption was no longer a vague concept wrapped in post-war trauma. It was standing right in front of him, alive, speaking, and still scarred from the choices he made under orders. He walked toward her slowly, unsure what forgiveness might even look like in a moment like this. "I don't know how to fix what happened. I don't even know if I deserve to say I'm sorry. But I need you to know I didn't know. I never knew a child was in that building." Elise's expression softened, but the pain didn't leave her eyes. "I know," she said, "but maybe we're both here because we're supposed to find something in each other. Closure, maybe, or clarity." They stood there in silence, neither quite knowing what came next, but both aware that the truth, raw and bleeding, had finally surfaced. And with that truth came the first fragile thread of healing. The flight from Salt Lake City to Washington, D.C. was silent, save for the occasional turbulence and the hum of the engines. Colby sat by the window, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the cloudscape, but his mind was miles away, half in the present, half in the jungles of a long-forgotten mission that had now taken form in a small-town waitress with a scarred hand. Rachel sat beside him, scrolling through images on her phone that the analyst had sent earlier that morning. Grainy satellite captures, time-stamped communications, a snapshot of the GPS coordinates burned into her wrist. They hadn't spoken much since takeoff, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. The path they were on now was no longer about satisfying curiosity. It was about uncovering a connection that defied logic and tore through the fabric of time, memory, and secrecy. When they landed, a black SUV met them at the private exit of Dulles Airport. An officer from the Department of Defense greeted them with a stiff nod and ushered them into the vehicle. No names were exchanged, no greetings. Just the cold efficiency of a government that had secrets to protect and no time for ceremony. Rachel glanced at Colby with concern. His jaw was clenched tight, his shoulders square, as if he was bracing for an ambush. He hadn't said a word since they'd stepped off the plane. She wanted to reach for his hand, reassure him somehow, but she didn't. Not yet. The SUV wove through the city and crossed into Maryland, eventually arriving at a nondescript building buried deep within a secure military compound. They were led through biometric scanners, past armed guards, and down a long corridor lined with doors that looked more like vaults than offices. At the end was a room labeled SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. Inside waited a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself only as Director Halverson. Her voice was calm, crisp, almost maternal, though every syllable carried the weight of someone who had long since learned to hide the human cost of what she dealt with. Without small talk, she tapped a remote, and the screen behind her lit up with satellite images. Jungle terrain, an abandoned compound, a tiny blip of coordinates, the same ones branded into the waitress's wrist. Halverson gestured to the image and then turned to Colby. This compound was decommissioned in 2004. Officially, it never existed. But you were there, Sergeant Barnes. You and Echo Team were deployed as part of Operation Downwell. Colby didn't nod, didn't blink. His voice came low, gritty. That mission was sealed. We were sworn never to speak of it. Halverson gave a slow nod. And you've done exactly that. Until now. But we believe something happened at that site. Something that no one in command anticipated. You reported an ambush, yes. You reported radio interference, power surges, hallucinations. But what you didn't report, she clicked again. The screen changed to a blurry thermal image, 7 figures moving through jungle heat, all registering human signatures. Then suddenly, one of the signatures pulsed, brighter, then gone. This was taken 1 hour before you sent your first distress call. And this, she tapped to change the slide, was taken 12 hours after exfil. One of your teammates, presumed KIA, was spotted here. Colby stared at the image. His throat tightened. It was Jacobs, his second in command. Last seen screaming into static during the final push-out of the compound. This doesn't make sense, Colby muttered. We ran DNA on those remains. It was confirmed. Halverson walked slowly toward him, a folder in hand. You were given the summary of the report, yes. But the classified findings suggest genetic markers inconsistent with human norms, a mutation, if you will. That site wasn't just a Black Ops bunker. It was a prototype for something else, something we now suspect may be responsible for anomalies like the one you encountered with the Waitress. Rachel leaned forward, her journalist instincts burning for clarity. What kind of anomalies are we talking about? Halverson turned to her with the same cool gaze. Displacement of time, inherited memory, transference of trauma through non-biological means. We believe the scar on the Waitress's hand isn't just a mark, it's a message. One passed from someone at that compound to her, possibly through a medium we still don't understand. Colby sat back, overwhelmed. The weight of the past was crushing him, but now it was more than memory. It was evidence. It was living proof that the nightmare had spilled into someone else's life. And not just anyone, a girl who shared his coordinates, his trauma, and somehow his story. Halvorsen handed him the folder. You're going back, not alone. But we need someone who was there, someone who can recognize what's real and what's not. The compound was reactivated 2 weeks ago. We picked up thermal readings. You'll be part of a recon team. Rachel, if you agree, will go too, as an observer. You both have 5 hours to prepare. The room fell into silence. Outside, the sun was setting behind a wall of reinforced glass, casting long shadows over the sealed floors. Rachel placed her hand over Colby's. He didn't pull away. Not this time. Whatever lay ahead, whatever waited in the ruins of that compound, he knew now that the story wasn't finished. And somewhere, in the folds of jungled memory and fractured timelines, a scarred Waitress held the key to all of it. The wind howled outside the modest cabin as dusk began to settle in, draping the pine-covered hills in a sleepy haze of amber and slate. Inside, the air had grown thick, not with tension, but with the kind of solemn understanding that lingers when truths finally settle into the open. Owen sat at the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly, the leather of his gloves creaking softly beneath his grip. Across from him, Sadie stood near the kitchen counter, motionless but not stiff, as though she were trying to steady herself against a tide of memory rising inside her. Neither of them had spoken in what felt like hours. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickers of orange light across the walls, tracing shadows along the wooden beams like ghosts remembering where they once stood. Owen's mind raced, struggling to untangle the strands of his past that had somehow led him here, where his most haunting mission collided headlong with the fragile human present, Sadie. Her name echoed again and again in his thoughts. Not just a name now, not just a Waitress with kind eyes and a scarred hand. She was a survivor of that compound, of that fire, of that operation. She had been there, not as a bystander, but as a child in hiding, in danger. And all this time, Owen had believed no civilians had survived that night. No one had spoken up. No one had returned. Until her. She turned then slowly, her eyes glassy but steady. There was a man that night, she said quietly, the words feeling like she was dragging them across shards of glass inside her throat. He pulled me out from the shadows, threw his own coat over me, and carried me across the courtyard. I remember the fire, the sirens, the shouting in a language I didn't understand. But I remember him. He had this tired look in his eyes. Not scared, just done. Like he'd seen too much. Owen swallowed hard, the air in his lungs suddenly too dry. He set me down by a tree outside the gate, told me to run to the road, not look back. I didn't even get to say thank you. I just ran. Her voice faltered, but she didn't cry. Not yet. I never knew his name. I was too young to understand what was happening. But I remember the patch on his uniform, the one with the wing and the arrow. I remembered it forever. Owen leaned back, overwhelmed by the tide of emotions crashing through him. Recognition, guilt, disbelief. That patch had been his unit's. Delta Archangel. A covert wing few even knew existed. He had been there. He had carried her. And he had buried that night so deeply he had stopped believing any part of it had remained real. And now, here she was, flesh and blood, memory, incarnate, reminding him that even when the past is buried beneath years and miles and silence, it still breathes. Sadie stepped closer, her hands wringing a dish towel absently. I searched for years. After I got adopted, after school, after I moved here. I didn't even know what I was looking for exactly. Just something to prove I wasn't imagining it. A person, a record, anything. But that mission doesn't exist on paper, does it? Owen shook his head. No, it doesn't. We weren't even supposed to be there. It was a black site sweep. Intel said it was a weapons lab with child laborers, but when we got in, it was worse. It was an indoctrination farm. They were training kids, training them to kill, and most of them didn't even know what was happening to them. Her jaw clenched, and a subtle tremble rippled through her arms. I was one of those kids, wasn't I? Owen didn't answer at first. He couldn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew any answer would reopen the wound. Finally, he said, "You were in a cell, alone. You had a sketch pad and a pencil. You were drawing something." I remember thinking how surreal it was to see a child drawing birds while the world was burning outside. Sadie exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, but not quite. "I still draw birds. Always have." The fire popped loudly behind them, as if to punctuate the weight of the moment. The two sat in shared silence. Two timelines crashing together, two lives shaped by the same night. Owen's memories had been carved with military precision, filed away and suppressed under layers of protocol, therapy, and denial. Sadie's had lived raw and untended, bleeding into her dreams, growing roots in her search for truth. But now that they had finally found each other, something unspoken passed between them, a sense of release. Not healing, not yet, but the first step toward it. Sadie sat down next to him, close enough to feel the heat from his shoulder. "I never wanted revenge," she said softly. "I just wanted to understand, to know who saved me, and why I was left alive when so many weren't." Owen looked down at her scarred hand resting on her lap. It wasn't just a reminder of that night. It was proof that survival didn't mean forgetting. It meant enduring. It meant carrying the weight of memory and still choosing to live. "You were left alive," he said, voice low, "because someone believed you deserved more than what that place had planned for you. And I think that someone might have been right." The moment hung in the room, quiet but alive. Outside, the wind settled, and snow began to fall gently, coating the ground in white like a new canvas, like a beginning. He stood still in the hospital corridor, arms folded tightly across his chest, watching the flickering fluorescent lights above him, as if the answers to everything might descend with the next hum of electricity. All the sterile scent and quiet beeping monitors brought back memories of the field hospitals, the tents soaked with adrenaline, the groans and cries echoing in the tropical night. He had tried so hard to push it all down, make it distant, impersonal, another life. But now, with Clara just a few doors down and her fate again tangled with his past, there was no separating who he used to be from who he was trying to become. The doctor's words still rang in his head, stable but guarded. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but the emotional toll was something no CT scan could measure. The girl had broken open something much older than either of them had ever realized. And when Clara whispered those numbers to him again through cracked lips, 21.9824 degrees north, 100, 1.2526 degrees west, he understood it wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't madness. It was the thread unraveling a much larger tapestry neither of them had been allowed to see. A knock on the frame of the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. It was Dr. Malhotra, clipboard in hand, her tired but sharp eyes narrowing in curiosity. She mentioned Clara had asked for him, that she'd been mumbling things, places, names, phrases, in languages that didn't belong in her mouth. When asked if she had family to contact, Clara only gave one name, James. That wasn't even his real name. That was his call sign in the field during the mission to Sierra Verde. James had been dead for years, at least in paperwork. But Clara had spoken it with clarity, as if it lived inside her the same way it haunted him. He didn't tell the doctor anything more. He simply nodded and followed her back into the room, where Clara lay with eyes half closed, her bandaged hand resting delicately across her chest. She was whispering to herself again, and as he leaned in, he caught more fragments. Sierra Verde, Ocelot Ridge, Sector Echo 5. Those weren't civilian terms. Those weren't in any books she could have read, not unless she had top-level clearance. He knew them because he'd been there. And more than that, because she had been there too, only not physically. It started to click. The girl was born just weeks after the operation. There had been locals, civilians whose lives were upended by the tactical sweep, the classified mission meant to dismantle the cartel's data relay and communications hub embedded in the jungle hills. The success of the operation had always been lauded in his unit, but no one spoke about the collateral damage. No one dared mention the scorched houses or the children left without parents, or the girl, a toddler, found screaming with a burnt hand next to her mother's lifeless body. The commanders at the time told them to stand down, to finish the sweep and move on, that cleanup crews would handle the aftermath. But he had never forgotten that sound, one that haunted his dreams like jungle insects in stereo. She had been there. He didn't know how she survived, who raised her, how she made her way to the U.S., but none of that mattered. Somehow, the past they shared had called her to the place he now called home, and somehow, the scar on her hand had been the bridge between their parallel traumas. He sat at her bedside, and for the first time, held her unbandaged hand in his calloused palm. It trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. He leaned in and whispered an apology, one he had never thought he'd be able to give, not to her, not to anyone. He told her everything. The mission, the heat, the screams, the moment he saw her as a child, but was pulled away by protocol. And then he told her something even deeper. That after all those years of avoiding people, of choosing silence over connection, she had become his mirror. Her survival, her resilience, had broken something in him, something hollow that had existed in place of guilt. Tears escaped the corners of her eyes as she nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. They were both products of something bigger, something violent and unjust. Yet here they were, years later, two ghosts from the same firestorm, sharing breath in a hospital room, miles from the jungle where it all began. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed in the chair beside her, head slumped against the wall, sleep drifting in and out like a tide. At some point during the night, Clara's hand found his again, gripping it tightly as if anchoring herself from drifting away. And in that quiet, something unspoken passed between them. Not quite peace, not quite closure, but something necessary, something like belonging. The next morning, the nurse came in to check her vitals and gasped lightly. Clara was sitting upright, eyes open, eating pudding as if nothing had happened. The scar on her hand was red and raw, but for the first time since the accident, she didn't try to hide it. Instead, she let it rest gently on the blanket, exposed. And James, no, Cole, his real name, stood beside her, arms crossed, watching her with something between pride and awe. He had thought he would be her ghost, the reminder of all that had gone wrong. But maybe, just maybe, he could become something else, something steady, something healing. He didn't know where the road would lead from here, or how they would explain this connection to anyone who asked. But he did know one thing. Their pasts had found each other, and now they were no longer alone. The echoes of the revelations still hung in the air as Logan left the church basement. His conversation with Father Talbot had given him clarity, but not closure. His feet carried him instinctively back toward where it had all begun, Gracie's diner. The late evening light cast long shadows on the sidewalk, mirroring the emotional length he had traveled over the past few days. The town seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because the weight of secrets had shifted his perspective. What once was just another quiet American town now felt like the final chapter of a story he had never meant to write but couldn't turn away from. As he approached the diner, he noticed the closed sign had been flipped, but inside, the lights were still on. Logan stood outside for a long moment, staring through the window. There she was, Ava, wiping down the counter with a slow, thoughtful rhythm, as if each stroke of her cloth was scrubbing away some invisible burden. He could tell she knew he was there even before she turned. When their eyes met, there was no surprise, no fear, just a calm acceptance, like two soldiers who had already survived the battle and were now standing in the silence of its aftermath. Ava unlocked the door without a word and stepped aside to let him in. The clink of the door chime felt like a clock restarting. Neither of them spoke as they sat opposite one another in the same booth where Logan had first noticed her hand. The scarred coordinates now burned into both of their histories. For a few seconds, silence reigned, not from awkwardness, but because words felt inadequate. Finally, Logan reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded document, an old mission file, yellowed with time and stained from where his fingers had gripped it too tightly. He slid it across the table. Ava's eyes flicked down to it, then slowly back up to his face, questioning but not alarmed. Logan whispered, barely able to push the words out, that he had found the truth. About her father. About the cover-up. About what he himself had unknowingly been part of. He told her about the tracker, about the false data they had been fed, and how the coordinates, her coordinates, were meant to be a dead drop for someone else, not a battlefield for a child. He watched as Ava's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the way someone's posture shifts when they've been holding in breath for a decade. She didn't cry. She didn't scream, she just nodded, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Ava then surprised him. She reached under the counter and brought out a journal, leather-bound, fragile, and well-used. She opened it and turned it to a specific page, revealing a hand-drawn map, nearly identical to the terrain Logan remembered from his mission. Her father's notes were scribbled all over it in precise, careful handwriting. Apparently, Ava had found the journal buried in a toolbox months after her father passed. It had coordinates, details, suspicions. Her father had always known something wasn't right, but he never told anyone. The scar on her hand wasn't just from the explosion. It was from tracing the same path he did, retracing his clues, trying to find what he couldn't say out loud. What Logan hadn't expected was the next few pages. They weren't written by her father. They were in Ava's handwriting. She had continued the journal. She had followed the trail. And in doing so, she'd discovered something else. Something Logan had missed. A list of names. Not just the original operatives, but the ones who had scrubbed the reports afterward. A shadow network of fixers who made inconvenient truths disappear. Her eyes met his, a flicker of resolve igniting within them. Logan could see it clearly now. Ava wasn't just the daughter of a victim. She was a seeker, a connector. She hadn't just survived the fire. She had been quietly building something within it. A case, a story, a reckoning. And now, with Logan's piece of the puzzle, they had enough to finish it. The next few days passed in a haze of activity. Logan and Ava spent hours cross-referencing their data, speaking in hushed tones, scanning documents, making digital backups, and contacting people Father Talbot had alluded to. Former journalists, one retired congressman, and a woman who once worked in intelligence but had vanished off the radar. Each person they reached out to didn't hang up. They listened. Because they all remembered something about Operation Echo Lure. And because they were all tired of being silent. What began as a solitary moment of recognition in a diner had now morphed into a coordinated effort to finally bring truth to light. But it wasn't just about the mission anymore. For Logan, this was atonement. For Ava, it was reclaiming a legacy. And for both of them, it was about standing up to the machinery that had tried so hard to make them forget. As they sat on Ava's porch one evening, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at the stars, Logan felt a strange peace settle over him. Not the kind of peace that comes from a completed task, but the kind that rises when you know you're finally walking in truth. Ava's head rested lightly on his shoulder. No words were needed. Their bond was sealed not through blood or family, but through scars, seen and unseen, and through a shared decision not to let the past dictate the future. Tomorrow, they would fly to D.C. together. They would meet a reporter at a trusted outlet with all the evidence in hand. But tonight, they just existed, side by side. Veterans of different wars, perhaps, but soldiers of the same story. The sound of the wind rustling through the cemetery's maple trees reminded Thomas of the still nights in the jungle, the kind that came right after a firefight, where every breath felt like a borrowed moment. He stood in front of a modest granite headstone, etched with the name Dr. Liana Greaves, and beneath it, a smaller inscription, "Born in War, Healed in Peace." His hands trembled slightly as he placed a bouquet of daisies at the base, the same kind she had absent-mindedly doodled on napkins when telling him about her favorite flower. A few yards behind him stood Samuel, his son, now grown and dressed in quiet reverence, holding his daughter's hand. The little girl looked at the grave with innocent eyes, not fully understanding why her grandfather's shoulders looked heavier than usual. But Thomas knew. He knew he was here not just to say goodbye, but to finally set something down that had been growing heavier over the decades, a burden of guilt, gratitude, and unresolved fate. The final days of Liana's life had unfolded like a book Thomas wasn't ready to finish. After the reunion at the diner and their deep confessional conversations that stretched into the early mornings, they began something new, something fragile, but beautiful. It wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, but rather a reunion of spirits who had once burned brightly under dire skies. Liana had confided in him more each day, about the surgeries she performed during captivity using makeshift instruments, about the girls she tried to protect when their captors threatened unspeakable horrors, and about the dreams that returned every time she closed her eyes. She had suffered just as deeply as he had, perhaps more, and yet she had emerged with a commitment to heal rather than avenge. That resolve had turned into action when she returned to the States and became a trauma surgeon. Her scars, both visible and not, became emblems of her mission to stitch others back together in a world that so often tore people apart. When her cancer diagnosis came, she bore it with the same quiet strength that had seen her through the jungle. Thomas stayed by her side, not just out of loyalty, but because he owed her everything. He'd told her as much, more than once, but she always waved him off with a half-smile and a knowing glance. She didn't want hero worship. She wanted presence. In those last weeks, she insisted on sitting outside when the sun was out, wrapped in blankets on a porch overlooking a field. She wanted to feel the wind, the sky, and the freedom that she never took for granted again. On one of those days, she pressed a folded letter into Thomas's hand. "For later," she'd said softly, her voice already thinning like paper. He hadn't opened it until the funeral. That evening, after the guests had gone, after the service ended and the earth had settled, Thomas sat on the same porch she had loved, now empty except for a rocking chair that swayed gently in the wind. He unfolded the letter with careful hands, heart clenched. "Dear Thomas," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm probably watching the clouds from a better place. A place without sirens, without cages, without pain. I never told you this, but that day you and your team arrived in the jungle, I had almost given up. I had hidden those coordinates on my skin as a final whisper to the universe, hoping someone would care enough to find me. You did. You always did, even when we barely knew each other. There are wounds that never close, but there is also a kind of healing that comes from being seen. You saw me. You never looked away. That saved me more than you'll ever know." Thomas paused, the letter trembling in his grasp. The rest of it continued, with stories of forgiveness, of hope, and of her desire that he live not just in remembrance, but in purpose. She asked him to visit the girls' school she had funded anonymously in her final years, a place that helped young women who had survived trafficking and violence. Her final wish was that he share their story, not for glory, but to remind others that even in war's darkest corners, mercy can grow. So he did. Over the next year, Thomas traveled more than he had in decades. He spoke at veterans conferences, to high schoolers, to churches, to shelters. He told their story, not of a soldier and a captive, but of two survivors who met across enemy lines and found something sacred in the rubble. He carried with him the photo they had taken together at the diner, both older, scarred, but smiling. And every time someone asked about the faded numbers tattooed on Liana's wrist, he told them the truth, that they weren't just coordinates. They were a cry for rescue, a code for humanity, and the starting point of a second life. Back at the cemetery, Thomas stood in silence as the sun dipped lower. He thought of how strange it was that one waitress's hand had unraveled the thread of his entire life's tapestry and rewoven it into something richer. As the air grew cooler and the shadows stretched, he whispered a silent thank you to the wind, hoping Liana could hear him. Then he turned, took his granddaughter's hand in his, and walked away from the grave, not in sorrow, but in solemn promise to carry her light forward. One story, one life, one act of mercy at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.